Greetings, fellow cultivators. Welcome to Autonova. Remember to like and subscribe to support the journey. Now, let's dive into the next chapter of A Will Eternal. When Chen Ju saw Zhou Yixing in his nine-colored flame, his expression instantly became one of deep respect. Nine-colored flame. A master necromancer. Zhou Yixing ignored Chen Ju, as if he felt soul cultivators weren't even worth looking at. All he cared about was Bai Xiaochun, or more specifically, the eternal parasol in his hand. However, after examining it for a moment, he seemed a bit unconvinced about Bai Xiaochun himself. Turning his gaze from the parasol to Bai Xiaochun, he asked, "Are you a soul cultivator, or a necromancer?" Nine-colored flame. Bai Xiaochun thought, his mind reeling as he stared at the fire in Zhou Yixing's hand. Based on what he could sense, it was clear that Zhou Yixing was not a nascent soul cultivator, but instead, was in the great circle of core formation. And yet, Bai Xiaochun could tell that if the power contained within the nine-colored flame were to be released, it would be shocking to the extreme. Even as Zhou Yixing was sizing up Bai Xiaochun was doing the same. He could tell that the young man was eyeing his eternal parasol, which he had originally pulled out to use as nothing more than a threat. Considering this newcomer's cultivation base, his nine-colored flame, and what Chen Ju had just said, Bai Xiaochun knew exactly what kind of person he was. Wildlands. Spirit enhancement. Necromancy. Based on the information Bai Xiaochun had learned years ago about necromancers, and the fact that he had seen so many spirit-enhanced magical items in the wildlands, he was already starting to come up with some theories about how the two were connected. However, now was not the time for protracted contemplation. Bai Xiaochun's gaze met Zhou Yixing's, and both of them could sense the powerful fluctuations emanating from the other. Frowning, and eyes glittering with cold light, Zhou Yixing said, "It's rare that I run into someone I can't personally assess. I'm going to ask you again. Are you a soul cultivator, or a necromancer?" As he spoke the words, the soul cultivators with him leveled icy gazes onto Bai Xiaochun. "A necromancer," Bai Xiaochun replied, narrowing his eyes. However, in his opinion, words alone wouldn't be very convincing. Therefore, after taking a quick moment to analyze Zhou Yixing's soul power fluctuations, he released some of the power of his cultivation base. Furthermore, he used the miraculous powers of the mask to adjust the fluctuations so that they seemed to be soul power instead of spiritual power. It was a powerful, domineering energy that could not come from a soul cultivator, and contained pressure that was unique to necromancers. Immediately, the surrounding soul cultivators' expressions flickered. As for Zhou Yixing, his pupils constricted as he quickly analyzed the soul power. Then he glanced at Bai Xiaochun's eternal parasol, and once again, a frown appeared on his face. "Was I mistaken just now?" he thought. "I could have sworn that my nine-colored flame bent toward him when he got close to me, as if it wanted to fly out of my hand in his direction. It only lasted for a moment before returning to normal, but that's definitely never happened before. Was it that parasol? No, I don't think so. There's something very strange about this guy. Well, maybe I can figure out the answer after killing him." Even as Zhou Yixing hesitated, Bai Xiaochun also stood there trying to decide what to do. Considering that it was nine-colored flame he was looking at, he was tempted to try to kill this young man and take it. After trying to assess how he measured up in strength, and then looking at the nine-colored flame, he was still hesitant, not because of the number of opponents, but because he wasn't sure how powerful nine-colored flame was. And yet, he couldn't stop thinking about the fact that he could perform a ninefold spirit enhancement on the eternal parasol with that flame, making it even more powerful, and also increase his chances of getting out of the labyrinth safely. "This guy doesn't know how fast I am, so if I suddenly make a move, he'll probably automatically use that nine-colored flame to attack me." As they stared at each other, both could see the coldness in each other's gazes. A moment passed, and then Zhou Yixing pointed at Bai Xiaochun with his left hand. "Kill him." Even as the words left his mouth, Bai Xiaochun took a step forward, instantly resorting to the top speed he was capable of. A series of afterimages stretched out behind him as he sped forward so quickly it made it impossible for anyone to react. In almost the same moment that he began to move, he was right in front of Zhou Yixing, his right hand rocketing forward in a fist strike. Although he wanted the nine-colored flame, he didn't reveal that fact in his first move, which was a punch leveled square at Zhou Yixing's chest. Zhou Yixing's eyes went wide. Never in his wildest imagination could he have guessed that his opponent would be so fast. After being struck, Zhou Yixing flew backward and waved his right hand through the air, causing the nine-colored flame to erupt into a sea of fire that moved to block Bai Xiaochun's attack. The surrounding soul cultivators were shocked by what was happening, but charged Bai Xiaochun nonetheless. As for Chen Ju, he moved to defend Bai Xiaochun. In the shortest of moments, fierce fighting broke out. To see a nine-colored sea of flame roaring toward him caused Bai Xiaochun's heart to start pounding. Although he had already decided to go all out in this battle, he could already sense how terrifying the nine-colored flame was, and was unsure if he could survive being hit with it. However, since the fight had already broken out, all he could do was grit his teeth and unleash his frigid chi. The power of a frigid paragon instantly filled the area, freezing the soul cultivators solid before they could do anything. The ground and tunnel walls alike were frozen, making the entire area a world of frigid coldness. When the frigid chi made contact with the nine-colored sea of flames, it sunk down into something like a mouth that opened up to swallow the fire. Intense rumbling sounds were spreading out into the labyrinth in every direction. Be sealed, Bai Xiaochun roared. Instantly, frigid chi began to converge onto the nine-colored flame in an attempt to seal it. However, the incredible nine-colored flame was actually causing the frigid chi to melt. Unfortunately for the nine-colored flame, it had no foundation upon which to burn, and therefore, it quickly began to grow dim, as if it might be snuffed out at any moment. Expression flickering, Zhou Yixing quickly prepared to pull the flame back into his hand. However, how could Bai Xiaochun possibly allow that to happen? In almost the same moment that the frigid chi made contact with the nine-colored flame, he snapped his eternal parasol open. The bizarre face yet again appeared, looked at Zhou Yixing, and then began to inhale. As for Zhou Yixing, it was to his terror that he felt something locking down onto his life force. The fact that his opponent had such shocking battle prowess, and also had a frigid domain, was completely mind-blowing. In response to the appearance of the ghost face on the eternal parasol, he reached up and pushed down onto the star sigil on his forehead, causing starlight to erupt out in an attack on the eternal parasol. The eternal parasol shivered, and yet, it had enough power to fight against Zhou Yixing's starlight, which in turn gave Bai Xiaochun just enough time to reach out and grab the sealed nine-colored flame. In one fluid move, he tossed the flame, and the frigid chi seal which contained it, into his bag of holding. After all, he realized that by using his frigid chi, he risked revealing his identity. Furthermore, the starlight magical technique that Zhou Yixing had just used seemed very bizarre, and considering that Bai Xiaochun had already acquired the nine-colored flame, he didn't want to keep fighting. Without any hesitation, he began to flee in the opposite direction. Are you looking to die? Zhou Yixing roared, his eyes brimming with rage and his hair starting to unravel from its top knot. So far, he still hadn't deduced Bai Xiaochun's identity. However, this opponent was blocking his path, had stolen his nine-colored flame, and made it impossible for him to have time to unleash any magical techniques. As such, his rage was burning extremely hot. Slapping his bag of holding with his right hand, he produced the black greatbow that he usually kept on his back. Speeding after Bai Xiaochun, he pulled the bowstring back and then unleashed a screaming, illusory arrow. It was a soul arrow formed from soul power, and as soon as it left the bow, it pierced through the air to appear right in front of Bai Xiaochun. His bow was a precious treasure that had received a ninefold spirit enhancement. The sheer power on display caused Bai Xiaochun's eyes to widen before yet again opening his eternal parasol to defend himself. Intense rumbling sounds rang out as the power of the parasol was unleashed. As for Bai Xiaochun, he trembled as the parasol absorbed the power of the attack, and yet was shoved backward nonetheless. After a moment, he struggled to a stop, whereupon he looked over at the greatbow. Why didn't you say that you had other precious treasures? He said, licking his lips. Instead of fleeing, he began to stride toward Zhou Yixing. Zhou Yixing's jaw dropped. Never before had he met someone as openly brazen as this. Not only had he stolen his nine-colored flame, but the mere sight of his greatbow caused him to stop fleeing and come back to rob him of it. Are you looking to die? Zhou Yixing roared a second time. Then he pulled the bowstring back and launched 3 soul arrows in rapid succession. Off in the distance, Chen Ju was shaking in fear. Although Zhou Yixing hadn't yet recognized Bai Xiaochun, the instant that frigid chi appeared, Chen Ju did, and it sent his mind into a tailspin. The first thing that popped into his head was that he himself was doomed to die. Howling inwardly in grief, he tried to decide whether or not to flee. Then, the fighting between Bai Xiaochun and Zhou Yixing started again. That was when something completely unexpected happened. Red hats, green hats, we're a bunch of little hats. Red heads, green heads, our favorites are the white heads. A strange chanting song that almost sounded like a nursery rhyme suddenly filled the air. There was something entrancing about the sound of the chant that left Bai Xiaochun, Zhou Yixing, and Chen Ju all completely shaken. Even more spine-tingling was the fact that it wasn't a single voice chanting the nursery rhyme, but a whole group of them. They sounded like children, laughing and giggling as they sang. As the sound of their voices moved along, invisible sound waves filled the air, causing the walls to begin to ripple. Then, faces appeared on the walls, one after another. There were men and women, old and young, and without exception, they appeared to be terrified. Then, they started to scream. "The Red Hats are coming! Run! The Red Hats are on their way!" The faces seemed to want to flee or hide, but couldn't. Even more bizarre, faces began to rise up out of the ground. Most shocking of all was that the walls began to move dramatically, causing the path behind Bai Xiaochun, Zhou Yixing, and Chen Zhu to be sealed up tight, placing them in a dead end. All three of the cultivators were physically trembling, and the hair on the backs of their necks began to stand on end. All of them were struck by a feeling that came, not from their cultivation bases but from their souls. It was the cold, prickly dread that one would face when being tracked down by a predator. It didn't matter that Bai Xiaochun cultivated the frigid school will evolving incantation, the coldness he felt right now left him shivering. What's going on? This dread left the entire group completely disinterested in fighting each other. All of a sudden, an agonized shriek rang out, and a hand shot out from the corner of the intersection just up ahead. The hand was dripping with blood, and as soon as it appeared, it tried to grab onto the wall, in clear view of Bai Xiaochun and the others. However, there was clearly something around the corner tugging on the owner of the hand. The hand flexed, and the fingers clawed against the wall to grab at something, and yet, it was soon dragged back around the corner. Then, horrifying crunching sounds could be heard, during which time the singing of the nursery rhyme ceased. Trembling violently, the terrified Chen Zhu inched over toward Bai Xiaochun, hoping that the proximity would bring him some measure of safety. Bai Xiaochun's face was ashen, and he was also shaking as he stared wide-eyed at the corner behind which the hand had just disappeared. What he wanted to do was flee in the opposite direction, but unfortunately, the three of them were now right in the middle of a dead end. Zhou Yixing seemed just as shocked. Through the several days in which he had been in the labyrinth, he had picked up a sizable group of followers, with whom he had survived several ambushes and cut down quite a few opponents. However, he had never encountered anything as bizarre as this. The terror he felt now caused his pupils to constrict as he stared at the corner where the hand had just disappeared. About then, the chewing sounds ceased, and the nursery rhyme resumed. Red hats, green hats, we're a bunch of little hats. Red heads, green heads, our favorites are the white heads. The joyful tone of the singing caused the scalps of all three cultivators to tingle on the verge of exploding. It was at that point that a bright red hat suddenly flew out from around the corner. The hat's brim dripped with blood as it swayed back and forth a bit, then suddenly stopped in place, as if it had just noticed Bai Xiaochun and the others. White heads, the hat said in the voice of a child. Then it began to fly forward, causing the group of three to back up. However, that was when it became clear the hat wasn't heading toward them, but rather, to the dozen or so soul cultivators who had been locked down within layers of ice. In the blink of an eye, the red hat landed on the head of one of the cultivators, causing the ice to instantly shatter and reveal the cultivator beneath. The cultivator wasn't dead, the flame of his life force was still burning. Instantly, his eyes opened, and his expression twisted with fear as he let out a miserable shriek. However, what was even more hair-raisingly shocking was what happened next. As the hat settled down onto the head of the soul cultivator, the man's body began to shake, and crunching sounds like chewing began to fill the air. Get off me, the cultivator screamed madly. He even reached up and grabbed the hat to try to take it off his head, but it did no good. After a few breaths of time passed, his struggling ceased, and he eventually just stood there motionless. Finally, the hat flew up into the air, dripping blood the entire time. At that point, Bai Xiaochun and the others could see that the cultivator's head was now completely white. That was because his skull was now visible. His skull wasn't intact though, there was a large chunk missing, allowing everyone to see that the inside of his head was now completely hollow. Red heads, green heads, our favorites are the white heads. The red hat sang, chuckling as it flew around in a circle and then landed on top of another of the ice-sealed soul cultivators. At the same time, more laughing, giggling hats flew around the corner, some of them red, some of them green. Red hats, green hats, we're a bunch of little hats. There were dozens of them, all dripping with blood as they flew along singing. Within moments, the hats were fighting amongst themselves to land on the heads of the sealed cultivators. However, there were only a dozen or so cultivators, and many more hats than that. Before long, there were no more cultivators available, and the hats began to turn their attention to Bai Xiaochun, Zhou Yixing, and Chen Zhu. In that very instant, the faces on the walls and floor began to scream. We're finished. Finished. They're here. The remaining hats began to laugh happily as they shot toward the group of three. Bai Xiaochun was already wound tight. Howling, he waved his hand to send over 1,000 paper talismans slapping down onto his body. At the same time, he tossed a whole stack over to Chen Ju. Run for your life, he shouted. Then he burst into motion, simultaneously donning numerous layers of armor, causing slapping sounds to echo out. Glittering light from more than 10 layers of armor filled the tunnel, along with the glitter of paper talismans. In the blink of an eye, he was off in the distance, blazing along at full speed with 7 or 8 hats chasing after him. Chen Ju gritted his teeth and slapped the paper talismans onto himself, simultaneously unleashing the power of his cultivation base as he prepared to go all out. Utilizing every magical technique he could think of, he began to flee, 5 or 6 hats pursuing him doggedly. Zhou Yixing stood there in mute astonishment. He almost wanted to cry at the unfairness of it all. Only 7 or 8 hats had chased Bai Xiaochun, and only 5 or 6 went after Chen Ju, leaving him there with nearly a dozen hats to deal with. How could this be happening? He moaned, his face turning ashen. Then, just as the dozen or so hats began to fly in his direction, he gritted his teeth and sent starlight shining out of the star sigil to fill the area. The hats suddenly flew out from the other side of the starlight, as if they hadn't been able to find Zhou Yixing at all. Then, the starlight began to fade, and Zhou Yixing was nowhere to be seen. The hats searched the area thoroughly, but when they couldn't find anything, began to fly off again, singing the entire time. Meanwhile, in another location in the labyrinth, more starlight appeared, from within which Zhou Yixing staggered out, coughing up a massive amount of blood as he did. His face was as pale as a sheet of paper, and the star sigil on his forehead was much dimmer than before. Damn it, I can't believe I had to use the power of my clan's star sigil. Thinking back to the bizarre hats, he couldn't help but shiver. After looking around to confirm that none of them were in the area, he finally breathed a sigh of relief. He stole my 9-colored flame, and then tried to rob me of my precious bow. He has frigid chi and a powerful fleshly body. Why does he seem so much like Bai Xiaochun? After reviewing everything he remembered about Bai Xiaochun, he was more convinced than ever that he had just encountered him, and yet, couldn't be sure. If that really was Bai Xiaochun, it means he has some sort of item that lets him change his aura. But, damn it, teleporting out of that situation has me completely turned around. I'm going to have to start searching for clues to find the right path again. Sighing, he began to move through the tunnels of the labyrinth once more. In the location where Bai Xiaochun, Chen Ju, and Zhou Yixing had just tangled with the hats, there now remained only a dozen or so soul cultivators, standing there motionless. They were nothing more than corpses, with their empty, white skulls clearly visible. It was a very bizarre sight. The faces on the wall and floor began to breathe sighs of relief and simultaneously chatter with each other about what had just occurred. They're finally gone. The red hats have gone. Ha ha ha, the hats were acting really strange today. They didn't bully us at all. Yeah, you're totally right. Very strange indeed. Something odd is going on. Then, in the middle of their conversation, their expressions flickered, and their eyes went wide. Looking down the tunnel, they all snapped their mouths shut. Currently, the terror glimmering in their eyes vastly exceeded that which had come from the hats, and they all began to shiver visibly. Further down the tunnel, a figure had become visible, blurry at first, but rapidly becoming clear. It was a beautiful young woman with long hair. For some unknown reason, there was something very bizarre about her, although it was impossible to say exactly what. So many people have come. Even my sweetie is here. The young woman chuckled, her eyes turning into twin crescent moons in the process and making her look even more pretty. At the same time, she looked profoundly bizarre, because visible within her eyes were 2 pupils each. Shockingly, she had 1 large pupil and 1 small pupil, the 2 of which overlapped. Anyone who might have been able to peer into her eyes would have been shocked to the core. As for Bai Xiaochun, if he had been present, he would immediately have recognized this young woman as being none other than Gongsun Wan'er. Except, he was currently in the middle of fleeing madly for his life from 8 hats. He had attempted to fight back, but his magical techniques were absolutely useless against them. He had even resorted to some of his special methods of increasing his speed, and yet the hats were always able to keep up. What are you chasing me for? My head doesn't taste that good. As he raced along pell-mell, he ran into the occasional soul cultivator or giant savage, which was when he finally came to realize that the hats weren't specifically after him. As the hats encountered others to eat, he was slowly able to lose them. When he was finally free, he breathed a sigh of relief. However, the thought of what he had just gone through continued to cause his heart to pound in fear. At the same time, though, the fact that the hats had given up chasing him to go after other people left him feeling a bit down. Don't tell me my head really doesn't taste very good after all? He grumbled. Finally, he cleared his mind of such thoughts and found an out-of-the-way corner where he could have some privacy. Waving his hand, he sent a mist spreading out to fill the area, as well as some frigid chi to lock the place down. Then, he licked his lips and pulled the 9-colored flame out from his bag of holding. After carefully removing the ice seal which contained it, he looked excitedly at the fire, which despite having grown dim, was still filled with 9 colors. Considering the intense heat he could sense from it, he was convinced that everything he had just gone through was worth it. This 9-colored flame is incredible. If it had been linked to a solid foundation, then my frigid chi would have been incapable of sealing it. With this flame, I can definitely perform a 9-fold spirit enhancement on the eternal parasol. Then it will be even more powerful than it already is, and will definitely make it much easier to stay safe around here. After looking around one more time to make sure he was alone, he produced his turtle walk and the eternal parasol, and prepared to begin the spirit enhancement process. However, after only a moment passed, he hesitated. I wonder if the energy of heaven and earth in this labyrinth will be sufficient. Back when he had performed some spirit enhancements in Great Wall City, he had clearly sensed that, because of the weak levels of spiritual energy, the enhancement process wasn't very stable. Thankfully, his miraculous turtle walk had ensured that the spirit enhancement worked no matter what. Therefore, despite having a dim 9-colored flame, and being in the middle of the labyrinth, he decided to grit his teeth and proceed with the plan. I need to increase my chances of getting out of here alive. That's worth doing a bit of testing. If it fails, then so be it. When it came to safeguarding his poor little life, Bai Xiaochun would never be stingy. Therefore, he immediately began the spirit enhancement process. As soon as the 9-colored flame was absorbed by the turtle walk, the designs on its surface began to shine with dazzling light. Bai Xiaochun looked on nervously, eyes wide, until the designs were fully lit. Then, he excitedly tossed the eternal parasol inside. The turtle walk immediately began to tremble, and the designs on its surface shone even more brightly, almost as if they knew what was happening. Then, the designs shot toward the eternal parasol, transforming into the 9th spirit design on its surface. A tremor ran through the eternal parasol, and Bai Xiaochun was almost sure he could hear something like an excited cheer. Then, the turtle walk went calm, and everything went back to normal. It worked? Just like that? I didn't feel any energy of heaven and earth at all. Surprised, he picked up the eternal parasol and examined it, confirming that the spirit enhancement truly had worked. Then he looked at the turtle walk again, and finally back at the eternal parasol. Every time he'd performed spirit enhancements in the past, it had always incited the energy of heaven and earth in the area, but this time, nothing of the sort had occurred. After thinking everything over, Bai Xiaochun's eyes suddenly glittered. The flame was different. For all of my other spirit enhancements, I always used multicolored flame fuel to make my own fire. But this time, I had the fire to start out with. Plus, it was Wildland's fire. Soon, Bai Xiaochun found himself thinking about soul cultivators and necromancers, and how they often had magical items with numerous spirit enhancements. As of this moment, he felt like he had another piece of the puzzle. Maybe the way they do spirit enhancement in the Wildlands doesn't require the energy of heaven and earth. Considering how barren of spiritual energy this place is, that seems like the only plausible explanation. After a bit of thought, Bai Xiaochun decided that a deadly labyrinth was not the place to sit around trying to analyze the situation. Shelving thoughts about spirit enhancement for the moment, he retracted the mist and the frigid chi, and then began to cautiously search for an exit. Another 2 days passed, and Bai Xiaochun's careful explorations did not lead to any more bizarre situations like the hats. However, he noticed that he seemed to be encountering fewer and fewer people, whether they were Great Wall cultivators or Wildlands soul cultivators and savages. Before, I was running into at least 10 per day. But now, it's more like 4 or 5, or even fewer. Looking around at the tunnel walls, he couldn't help but feel like the labyrinth was a huge mouth intent on consuming everyone. The thought made him shiver. I can't let that happen to me. I have to find the exit. But everything looks the same. How do I get out? None of the ideas he came up with, such as leaving marks on the wall, were of any use whatsoever. Finally, he just resorted to his old, somewhat mindless method of sticking to the right. As he proceeded along, another 3 days passed. Soon, he was feeling so lost he was dizzy, and was also scowling on the verge of tears. That was when he turned a corner, and saw something that caused his eyes to go wide. A creepy sensation filled him, becoming an icy coldness that left him gasping. There were no hats. Instead, he found himself looking at something like a large, open square, with tunnels leading into it from all four directions. Right in the middle of the square were two enormous candles with green flames that cast odd, flickering light out. As a result of the shadows cast by the flames, the square seemed completely terrifying. Sitting between the two candles was an enormous platter, atop which was a mountain-like pile of steamed buns. However, these buns appeared to be soaked in blood, so much so that they were dripping with it. It was a horrific sight that caused Bai Xiaochun's scalp to tingle so hard it felt like it might explode. Gathered in the square were several hundred Great Wall cultivators and Wildlands soul cultivators and savages. There were even a few necromancers too. All of them were standing there motionless, expressions those of madness as they stared at the blood-soaked buns. Although none of them were talking, it was possible to hear them panting as they stood there. A fragrant, sweet aroma wafted up from the blood-soaked buns that, when it entered Bai Xiaochun's nose, made him so nauseated he wanted to vomit up his internal organs. Bai Xiaochun's face went completely ashen, and not because his cultivation base had been affected, but because of the fear he felt. Within the group of 100 gathered in the square, there were a few with nascent soul cultivation bases. That left Bai Xiaochun feeling thoroughly petrified. He started backing up, and yet, had only taken a step when he realized that there were people in the square that he recognized. Zhao Long, Master God Diviner. The two of them were behaving just like everyone else in the square, staring at the platter of blood-soaked buns, their expressions those of savage madness. By this point, Bai Xiaochun was starting to struggle over what to do. Zhao Long has been a loyal and devoted follower of mine for years now. Back when I got stuck on the battlefield, he led the charge to try to reach me. Slowly but surely, Bai Xiaochun's eyes were starting to turn bloodshot. I'm the one who forced Master God Diviner to become my Dao protector, and I'm also the one who conscripted him into the army. The tribulation the two of them are facing today all has to do with me. Bai Xiaochun was so torn he could hardly breathe straight. His eyes were completely bloodshot, and yet, at the same time, he was scared. The terror he felt at the thought of dying was almost completely overwhelming. Clearly, the square that stretched out in front of him was a location of extreme danger. If he turned and left now, he would most likely be able to get away safely. But if he stepped into the square, who knew whether or not he would get swept up into the calamity? As he stood there wallowing in indecision, it was almost as if there were two people on either side of him, one telling him to go save his friends, the other screaming at him to flee immediately. Bai Xiaochun couldn't help but think back to the situation with the Luokan clan all those years ago. Although his current predicament wasn't exactly the same, it was certainly similar. As he stood there vacillating, the flames on top of the huge candles suddenly danced wildly, which caused the several hundred cultivators in the square to suddenly howl madly as they rushed toward the platter of blood-soaked buns. To their eyes, what lay on the platter in front of them was not a pile of blood-soaked buns, but rather, the ability to live forever, or to increase their cultivation bases, or other types of amazing good fortune. In the briefest of moments, all of them went crazy, even going so far as to start fighting each other to be the first to grab a blood-soaked bun. Those who did manage to get a hold of one of them would excitedly take a huge bite and then start cackling madly. Any who didn't get one of the blood-soaked buns would fly into a rage and look for someone to steal a bun from. The scene playing out in front of Bai Xiaochun right now left him trembling with fear and terror. Furthermore, because he was watching from an outsider's perspective, he quickly realized that none of them were actually eating blood-soaked buns. What Bai Xiaochun had assumed to be corporeal buns were actually not real. The people in the square were actually fighting over nothing. Furthermore, those who believed they were eating a bun were actually voraciously devouring their own hands. Some of them had already ripped their own fingers off, causing blood to spray about everywhere. And yet, they weren't satisfied. It was with complete insanity that they went on to bite their palms, crunching them all the way down to the wrist. And some of them were even chewing their way down to their own elbows, expressions of delight on their faces the entire time. Those in the square who weren't able to snatch one of the blood-soaked buns were madly trying to rip the hands and arms off of those who had. Bitter fighting was already playing out everywhere. Some people were cut down by magical attacks, and as their flesh and blood exploded out, others in the area would pile onto them and start to feast. As all of these things began to happen, the flames of the two enormous candles danced, and female voices could be heard, singing, "Eat up, eat up. Delicious, isn't it?" Bai Xiaochun felt like his mind was being struck by countless lightning bolts, and he was shaking visibly at the horror in front of him. That was when he saw Master God Diviner finally get one of the blood-soaked buns, and then begin to laugh uproariously as he lifted his hands up toward his mouth. Off to the side, Zhao Long, who hadn't managed to get his hands on the prize, was now starting to fight over one of the corpses of the other cultivators. In that moment, Bai Xiaochun's hesitation vanished. Eyes bloodshot, he made his decision. Throwing caution to the wind, he took a step forward. The instant his foot touched down in front of him, everything around him seemed to slow down. At the same time, his frigid qi rushed out in all directions to fill the square. In the next instant, Bai Xiaochun moved with such incredible speed that, combined with his frigid domain teleportation, he appeared right in front of Master God Diviner. Without hesitating at all, he reached out and grabbed Master God Diviner's hand in the instant before it reached his mouth. Jerking the hand back, he shouted, "Master God Diviner, wake up." A snapping sound rang out as Master God Diviner's teeth clicked down on nothing but air. Then he looked up at Bai Xiaochun and howled. Clearly, anyone who interfered with him in any way was little more than an enemy. Master God Diviner's hand blurred in an incantation gesture and then shoved out at Bai Xiaochun. At the same time, he lunged forward like a rabid dog as he tried to bite down onto the hand Bai Xiaochun had grabbed. Bai Xiaochun looked over anxiously at Zhao Long, who was now laughing madly as he dragged one of the corpses off to the side. Unfortunately, Bai Xiaochun's vision was starting to cloud over. In fact, the blood-soaked buns on the platter up ahead were now starting to transform into live forever never die pills. The mere sight of such pills caused Bai Xiaochun's mind to reel. However, he bit down onto his tongue to clear his mind. Already, the frigid qi in the area was beginning to fade away, meaning that time was very limited. "Damn it," he yelled. With that, he reached out with his left hand and grabbed Master God Diviner by the throat. Holding him fast no matter how he struggled, he rushed over to Zhao Long, who was just in the middle of taking a bite of bloody flesh, and grabbed him up. Then he rushed back toward the tunnel mouth. Suddenly, two soul-chilling screams erupted from the candle flames as two women became visible. They looked exactly the same, middle-aged with disheveled hair, and they were both looking straight at Bai Xiaochun. "How dare you meddle in our affairs? You've disturbed our sacrifice of flesh and blood, and therefore, you will not leave this place alive." In response to the voices, Bai Xiaochun shuddered. Then he looked around, and saw everything in the area slowly becoming piles of live forever never die pills. Live forever. Live forever. Even as he felt himself descending into madness, all of a sudden, a tiny strand of willpower rose up in his gold core. The willpower poured into his mind like boiling water poured onto snow. Instantly, the illusions he had been seeing vanished, and he looked around ashen-faced to find that more than 80% of his frigid qi had been melted by the candles. Once it was completely melted, he would be incapable of teleporting away, and would have to rely only on his fleshly body speed to escape, which wouldn't be sufficient. By this point, many of the cultivators in the area had caught sight of Bai Xiaochun, and to them, he was good fortune to be had. They quickly began to turn and head in his direction. Roaring, Bai Xiaochun called upon all the power he could muster to teleport through his frigid qi. Even as it collapsed, he appeared right at the edge of the square, and then bolted into the nearest tunnel entrance. Looking over his shoulder, he saw the two women floating in the candle flames, screaming at him. "Think you can escape just like that?" they screamed, suddenly flying into the air toward him. Even as he fled at top speed, the air rippled in a different tunnel, and Gongsun Wanner appeared. Striding forward, she shoved her right hand out viciously in the direction of the two women. "Screw off. How dare you try to mess with one of my people?" The two women screamed miserably. Although the wave of Gongsun Wanner's arm had not contained even a bit of magical power, the two women flickered as if they might vanish. At the same time, expressions of unprecedented shock and terror appeared on their faces. Not daring to move forward even an inch, they dropped down and kowtowed. "Get back to your sacrifice of flesh and blood," Gongsun Wanner said coolly. "And from now on, mind your own business." As she spoke, the tiny second pupil in each of her eyes began to shine with a mysterious light. It was that very light that caused the two women to tremble in terror, and creep backward toward their candles. Bai Xiaochun raced down the tunnel, unaware of what was happening behind him in the square. Eventually, when he was far enough away that he couldn't detect even a bit of the sweet aroma, he finally slowed down and then checked his surroundings. Convinced he was far enough away from the square, he put Zhao Long and Master God Diviner down, both of whom were unconscious. Master God Diviner seemed in better shape than Zhao Long, who was currently biting down on a chunk of bloody flesh. Bai Xiaochun removed the chunk of flesh and put a medicinal pill in Zhao Long's mouth, and then did the same for Master God Diviner. Then he bopped them both on the top of the head. The two of them shivered, and then slowly opened their eyes. They looked up in confusion at Bai Xiaochun with his mask on, and then looked around to try to determine their location. Finally, they recalled what had occurred in the square, and both of them began to retch. Zhao Long even curled up into the fetal position. Upon recovery, Master God Diviner looked at Bai Xiaochun with an expression of gratitude. Clasping hands, he bowed and said, "Many thanks for your kindness in rescuing us, fellow Taoist." He was well aware that, considering how terrifying the situation had been, without someone there to rescue him, he might have ended up eating himself to death. The residual fear still had him trembling. After Zhao Long managed to stop vomiting, he looked at Bai Xiaochun with clasped hands and then bowed deeply. Although Bai Xiaochun looked like a soul cultivator, he was still profoundly thankful. "This place is very dangerous," Bai Xiaochun said. "You two take care of yourselves." By now, he felt physically and emotionally exhausted. From the moment he had entered this labyrinth, he had been fighting with cultivators or running from terrifying entities, and it was getting very hard to handle. Whether it was the red hats or the blood-soaked buns, they all left Bai Xiaochun feeling very threatened. Sighing, he gave Master God Diviner and Zhao Long some medicinal pills and paper talismans, then left. He chose not to take them with him. If his identity were revealed, it would place them all in great danger. Besides, he had the feeling that going around in this place on his own was much safer. After he left, Master God Diviner and Zhao Long exchanged a silent glance, then looked down thoughtfully at the medicinal pills and paper talismans they had been given. Then they talked for a bit, which led them to the decision of joining forces. A few more days went by. Bai Xiaochun made his way through the labyrinth as cautiously as ever. Unfortunately, after leaving the square with the blood-soaked buns, he was just as lost as ever. Gritting his teeth, he used the same method as before to try to figure out where exactly he was. However, the more time that passed, the more his fear mounted. Before long, he reached a point where he hadn't seen anyone else for a full 2 days. The entire labyrinth seemed filled with nothing other than corpses, and his heart was wound as tight as a taut bowstring. Something weird is going on. Don't tell me that more than 100,000 people are all dead? The thought left him feeling completely stifled. He had no idea where he was heading, and couldn't find the exit. He couldn't leave marks on the walls to keep track of where he'd been, and actually had the feeling he was going in circles. On top of it all, he now felt like he was alone. He was so jumpy about everything that he wasn't even thinking about his mask and disguise. Another day passed. He had decided to pick up speed, and yet, still hadn't encountered anyone else. His terror grew. Then he thought of the person who had landed him in his mess, and gnashed his teeth. "Damn that Chen Hichan. I served the Great Wall well, and this is how you repay me." It was in that moment of rage when Bai Xiaochun suddenly heard the sound of whistling air. Apparently, someone was heading in his direction at top speed. Considering it had been days since he'd seen anyone else, he was actually delighted. However, at the same time, he maintained full vigilance, backing up and keeping his eye on the intersection up ahead. At the same time, the whistling sound stopped, as if whoever it was on the other side of the corner had also detected the presence of another. Bai Xiaochun had no idea who was around that corner. It could be a person or a ghost for all he knew. Whoever it was, they seemed equally befuddled about Bai Xiaochun. For a very long moment, nothing happened as the two of them stood there silently, the tension mounting. Finally, Bai Xiaochun took in a quiet breath and pulled a flying sword out. With the wave of a sleeve, he drew upon his control power to send it flying toward the intersection. Meanwhile, a black shaft of light flew out from the other side of the corner. Within that black shaft of light was a soul arrow which slammed into Bai Xiaochun's flying sword, shattering it to pieces. A moment later, the soul arrow was right in front of Bai Xiaochun, forcing him to summon a huge cauldron to block its path. Even as the resulting boom shook the area, Bai Xiaochun suddenly laughed. As soon as he saw that soul arrow, he recognized the type of arrow it was, and thought of the bow which shot it, and of Zhou Yixing. He actually didn't know Zhou Yixing's name, but he did remember the star sigil on his forehead. Because the character, Star Xing, rhymed perfectly with the character, Gorilla Xing, he decided to make up his own name. "So, it's you, Mr. Gorilla." Now that he was sure that he was dealing with a person, and not some freakish entity, his spirits were lifted immediately. Rushing forward, he burst into the intersection in almost the same moment that Zhou Yixing emerged. When Zhou Yixing saw Bai Xiaochun, his expression flickered. He had been jumpy with fear lately himself. Although the bizarre entities in the labyrinth weren't completely impossible to escape from, without his star sigil, Zhou Yixing would likely have been killed long ago. At the moment, he seemed to be in bad condition. His hair was disheveled, and his bag of holding was running low on magical items. Worse, his star sigil was fading away from being used so many times. Once it ran out, the only way to get a new one would be to return to his clan and kowtow in front of the ancestral shrine for 49 years. As far as he was concerned, the main reason he was on the verge of losing his star sigil was Bai Xiaochun. Before encountering him, everything in the labyrinth had gone well, but afterward, he had been plagued with bad luck. Never could he have imagined that after days without seeing anyone, the first person he would encounter would be Bai Xiaochun. "You're the gorilla, Bai Xiaochun," he shouted. "Everyone in your family is a gorilla." Actually, he wasn't completely sure who this person was, but was convinced that he had to be Bai Xiaochun. Even as Bai Xiaochun neared, Zhou Yixing lifted his great bow and unleashed a rapid succession of 9 soul arrows. In response, Bai Xiaochun laughed and opened his eternal parasol, easily blocking all of the soul arrows before closing in on Zhou Yixing. Zhou Yixing immediately noticed the 9 designs on the eternal parasol, and recalled that before, it only had 8. His eyes turned red, and he let out a bellow of rage. It didn't take much speculation on his part to reach the conclusion that his own 9-colored flame had been used to perform another spirit enhancement. The fact that Bai Xiaochun had succeeded with the spirit enhancement on the first time seemed like a complete stroke of luck, and further incensed Zhou Yixing. "No need to get angry, Mr. Gorilla. Just tell me what your name is." Closing the eternal parasol, he performing an incantation gesture and waved his hand, sending frigid chi blasting out to form a hail of ice spikes which sped toward Zhou Yixing. The truth was that Bai Xiaochun was very happy to have encountered Zhou Yixing, and was not inclined to kill him, not after spending so many days alone. He had even begun to regret leaving Master God Diviner and Zhao Long behind, so any familiar face at all was like a blessing. "I'm Zhou Yixing, you moron," he roared, leaping back to avoid the ice spikes, and simultaneously performing a double-handed incantation gesture that caused numerous vengeful souls to burst out from inside of him. The souls quickly merged together into a magical symbol, which then erupted with soul fire as it moved forward to meet the ice spikes. Rumbling sounds echoed out as the ice spikes shattered, releasing a shockwave that Zhou Yixing took advantage of to retreat. At the same time, he shot out a succession of 18 soul arrows. "Time to die," he screamed. Without his eternal parasol, Bai Xiaochun would have had a hard time dealing with Zhou Yixing's bow, which also had received a 9-fold spirit enhancement. But things were different now. Zhou Yixing? You mean the Xing for gorilla? So you really are a gorilla. Ha ha ha." Bai Xiaochun snapped open the eternal parasol and yet again blocked the soul arrows, then unleashed his frigid chi to send out a volley of ice spikes. His plan was to capture Zhou Yixing alive, and then hopefully extract some necromancer secrets from him. Even better, if he ran into some powerful enemy, he could toss him out as bait or cannon fodder. Thus, this episode comes to an end. Remember to like and comment so we can discuss the story together. Until we meet again in the next chapters.